and welcome to Peace Talks. My name is Rajni Bakshi and I'm a trustee of Citizens for Peace. And what we've attempted to do in Peace Talks is really to look at peace not as the absence of violence, but as the active presence of well-being. And we've looked at a wide range of issues. Today we are going to look at and hear the reflections on how we can prevent communal violence. So I'd like to start by thanking all our speakers, Nandita Das, who like our other two speakers needs no introduction, Harsh Mandar and Shiv Vishwanathan, and special thanks to Harsh and Shiv because they've come all the way from Delhi and Ahmedabad for the meeting. This is an exercise really in collective open-minded thinking rather than in stating of our positions, and it's a shared search for multiple answers and multiple truths. So welcome, and over to Harsh.
When I talk to people from the Muslim community, I'm struck by the fact that they describe their lives routinely almost as the space between riots. The points are, during this riot I was here, this happened to me and my family, this riot, this happened. I also visit, I've made it part of my life to go back over and over again to sites of old massacres from Nelly in 1983, Assam in Assam, Delhi, the widows in 1984 and so on, Gujarat, Bhagalpur. And one thing that strikes me is that 20 years may pass, 25 years may pass, but the suffering doesn't seem to go away. In fact, it takes 10 or 15 minutes, and if you're engaging with some degree of empathy, people start recounting the pain of what happened with an urgency as if it happened just yesterday. There are many reasons why we need to battle communal violence, but I think the enormity of suffering that is for which probably one lifetime is far too short to overcome is one of many reasons why we need to see an end to communal violence. My own engagement with communal violence, I think, goes perhaps to before I was born. My parents, like many others, had moved in the midst of violence from Rawalpindi in what is now Pakistan. I was in the civil services, and I remember, one of the events that most shaped me was the 1984 violence as a young administrator in Indore. And I've handled riots right through the whole Babri Masjid period in small districts. And I left the service in the aftermath of the 2002 violence, and the last 10 years I have spent a lot of time with people who lived with violence, and all of this has shaped my understanding. The question, I think the obvious starting question is, what is it that causes communal violence to erupt with this regularity and with this ferocity all over the country? And many people have thought about it, and somewhat simplifying, there are two kinds of answers. People like Ashutosh Varshni have talked about riots really as the outcome of, where Hindus and Muslims, for instance, live together without close social bonds, economic bonds, cultural bonds. Riots occur much more, according to him, than where these bonds are closer. And that intuitively seems to make sense. But that suggests that Hindus and Muslims as people tend to spontaneously battle each other from time to time. I am one of those who passionately, strongly disagrees with this understanding of why riots take place, because I believe it's been my observation over a long period of time that ordinary Indians, Hindus and Muslims, tend to live together civilizationally with peace and understanding. And ironically, more and more the case, the less educated, the less wealthy people tend to be, the more they seem to know how to live together with peace and understanding. Riots really, to my mind, with scholars like Paul Brass, riots occur primarily in a process where hatred is systematically manufactured. And riots actually take place when the state is complicit both in the process of enabling and allowing hatred to be manufactured, but also where then the state is complicit when violence breaks out, and it is complicit also in ensuring a culture of impunity, that people are not punished after the riots, and therefore there's no deterrence for the next episode to take place. I think India has witnessed primarily pogroms rather than riots, and therefore, if I have to look at how riots can be prevented, my understanding centrally rests on the role that the state must be made to play. Going back to independence, when India became free, we chose to have a fully elected government at the center and at the state, but at the district, we chose to continue with the system of a selected civil service because of the whole idea of the steel frame. The expectation was that politics in India and social movements would continue to generate primal passions based on identity of community and caste and religion. And it was expected that the civil service would stand as a bulwark and act with fairness and hold this country together. I think it did so initially, but in the last 20-25 years, we've seen a civil service becoming more and more complicit in these pogroms, and therefore the ferocity of these pogroms has also increased a great deal. But please take it as somebody who has been a serving administrator. No riot can go on for even a few hours without the active complicity of the state. Active. And therefore the enormity of a crime when a riot takes place, I immediately wonder what civil servants, I mean in the 1984 riots, I as a young no great heroism, but as somebody who was a complete greenhorn, I was able to realize that you could call in the army, you had to call in curfew, you can quell the severest of riots if you choose to. Now in a situation like where, say, Gujarat, where across 17 districts, the officers did nothing to control the riots except with a few very honorable exceptions which actually proved what could be done. How do you prevent that from happening the next time? And that is why I sincerely believe that it's a sad that no longer can we hold our civil servants just morally accountable to do their duty at such moments. We will have to hold them legally accountable. And therefore, we conceived of a bill which is centered around the notion of dereliction of duty and of public officials. And very importantly, not acting, which is the best way to allow a riot to happen, has been designated a crime for which a civil servant can go to jail for 5 years. And we've also linked it to the notion of command responsibility, where it's not going to stop just at that officer, but wherever command was actually exercised, that person will also be accountable. And I believe very strongly that if such a law was in place, say in 2002 or 1984, I know my own former colleagues in the civil service, whatever might have been, they would not have risked their careers and the chance of going to jail, and they would have performed their duty, and if they had, these riots would have been, these massacres would have been prevented. There's also, the question of the aftermath of violence, and there's a whole process of subversion of justice in which again states are complicit, and there's a lot that we feel needs to be done to strengthen victims' rights. But there's one thing that I again would like to highlight. Our whole criminal justice system is based on the assumption that the state will always be on the side of the victim against the accused. So the entire human rights framework has been constructed rightly to protect the rights of the accused. But when we see a situation like a riot, where the state is actually on the side of the accused and not on the side of the victim, is actually hostile to the victim, the entire legal system breaks down, because the state, instead of trying to investigate a crime, tries to protect the wrongdoer, and therefore we find a whole culture of impunity where people know that they can commit a crime you know, you can, if you commit one murder, you're likely to get caught, but if you commit a mass of murders in public view, there's very little chance that you'll see the inside of a jail or be punished. And that again is something that we feel needs to be changed by a whole system of victims' rights in such situations. And thirdly, you know, in the entire healing process, it has been completely politicized, the whole business about rescue, relief, rehabilitation. You know, you can have a person like Narendra Modi saying, I refuse to set up relief camps. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I just refuse to do it. I won't do it because I don't want to set up baby producing factories. I mean, with that contempt, and you are allowed to get away with it by law, we are saying that there should be a set of duties that are prescribed, a floor of standards that must be followed if mass violence does take place. Around this, we have constructed a law, and I believe that this law is not going to in itself end violence. I'm not claiming that. But I think that it will give instruments in the hands of people who believe in the idea of India sufficiently to be able to withstand, resist, demand accountability, make their public officials perform their most important duty in a secular democracy, and ensure a process by which justice is done, by which healing happens. I recognize that a law, any law, cannot in itself change social realities. And let's take something as different as untouchability before I end. You know, I'll just give an instance of also acknowledging the limitations of law. I was a district magistrate somewhere, and some people came to me and told me that, you know, in our village, we are Dalits, nobody is allowing us to draw water from the well. So of course I dropped everything, I went with them. I went to the village, called a meeting, I said this is completely illegal and you must allow people to draw water from the well. And people sort of looked unhappy, but they didn't resist, and they drew water, they drank it, I drank the water, and I thought everything was well, and I went off. Some 3 months later, I was passing by and I said, let me just go back and check what's happening, and I drove to the Dalit village and I called them and I said, is everything okay? Okay. Are you able to draw water from the well? Yes. But from that day, the upper caste have stopped drinking water from this well. And it really struck me about what law can do and what law cannot do. But I believe that law must do what it must do. And that we needed the law to come in very strongly and say, this is not permissible by the law of this land, by our common morality as reflected in the Constitution. But beyond that, we'll have to do a lot more to ensure that the upper caste also drank water from the same well.